The American Civil War ended more than 155 years ago, and yet we still argue over the war's origins and its nature. What was it fought for? Right? What caused it? And many people, at least in my experience and from listening to some of the conversations surrounding current events, it's clear that many people still believe that the Civil War was about something called states' rights. And this is, unfortunately, to me, one of the most powerful lingering myths in all of American history. That's something that was invented after the Civil War as part of a broader movement of reconciliation that included this sort of myth of the lost cause, the purpose of which was really to sanitize the war's origins so as to make reconciliation between North and South more palatable, especially to the people of the North, and also to welcome the people of the South back into the Union in a more dignified way. I think it would have been much more difficult had the war's origins and causes been fought out for another several generations once the war itself was over. But this was an invention of the post war years. If you look at all of the available relevant evidence from the years 1860 and 61, you'll see that the main cause of the American Civil War was, in fact, slavery. That those who were or would become Confederate leaders made it clear that they were leaving the Union because they believed that Republicans under an Abraham Lincoln administration would continue to attack the institution of slavery. They already had tried to restrict it from spreading westward, had done so more or less successfully, but they were openly hostile to the institution and believed, the Confederates believed that Republicans would attack it where it existed in the South. There's no evidence for that, but that's why they said they left. In fact, if you look at South Carolina's two major secession documents, the official documents that came out of the December 1860 secession convention, you see in their language to that effect that they said they were leaving basically for two reasons. One was that northern states had refused to, many of them had refused to honor the constitutional provision for the return of fugitive slaves, okay? So, which is ironic in some ways, right? Because Confederates actually withdrew, South Carolina withdrew, and other states did likewise, because northern states had been exercising their so-called states' rights in trying to prevent slaveholders from recovering fugitives. And South Carolina's declaration of the causes of secession also indicated that South Carolina was leaving because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, that's part of the historical record. South Carolina also sent a separate address to her sister slaveholding states. And part of the language of that address, I'm paraphrasing here, but part of the language went something like, "We desire no destiny separate from yours," okay? Meaning that South Carolina was inviting other slaveholding states into a great slaveholding confederacy. And they actually used that phrase, slaveholding confederacy. In 1861, January 1861, the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, gave his farewell speech to the U.S. Senate. And in that speech, he said, I think the states that have a right to secede, and we've heard too much about this Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal, and it's very clear to me that all men are created equal was not meant to include black people. And then in March of 1861, the vice president of the Confederacy, a man named Alexander Stephens, gave a speech at Savannah, and it's come to be known as his cornerstone speech, very famous or infamous nowadays. And in that speech, Stephens said, our new government is the first in the history of the world It's the first that's based on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That white supremacy, in other words, was what he called the cornerstone of the new Confederate government. So, in light of the official secession documents that came out of the South Carolina Convention, in light of the specific language of the Confederate president and the Confederate vice president, it's really, to me, almost impossible to make the case that the Civil War was rooted in anything other than slavery and a desire on the part of the Confederate leaders to expand, to protect, and ultimately to expand the institution of slavery. The Confederates thought that slavery had been a good thing. They thought it had been a good thing for themselves, for the white masters, and they thought that it had elevated the blacks to a condition that they would not have realized had they been left in Africa. That is in stark contrast to dominant opinion in the late 18th century. At some point along the way, there was a serious change in Southern thinking on the nature of slavery, and that's a much more complicated topic. But make no mistake, okay, the Confederacy was designed to be a defense, an active defense, not against an actual aggression, but against the perception of a possible future aggression on the part of the Lincoln administration vis-a-vis the institution of slavery. So I say all of this in large part because there's a good deal of conversation and controversy about the Confederate battle flag and about various Confederate statues, that the flag having been removed, for instance, by the Mississippi legislature from the Mississippi state flag, and the various mobs that have been doing their dirty work, tearing down statues of Confederate leaders and others, by the way, very indiscriminately. I'm not in any way endorsing the woke BLM mob. In fact, I have nothing but contempt for those people. Many of them have no idea what they're doing, and the ones who do know what they're doing have nefarious purposes, Marxist purposes, and I think that's becoming clear to a greater number of people than was the case about a month ago. But be that as it may, it is possible to make an argument to get rid of things like the Confederate flag and Confederate statues on grounds of what the Confederacy really stood for, because it did stand for slavery primarily. That's what the leaders were doing. But I just want to make a case, not necessarily for keeping various Confederate symbols or memorabilia or statues in public squares. I mean, I think every community has a right to decide who or whom or what it wishes to honor in its public square. Certainly don't tear things down in a rage, but if you want to have a serious debate and then ultimately remove the statues, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But in so doing, I would ask the folks who want to go about it the right way, I would ask them to think about the possibility that what they're tearing down might actually include something that you don't really want to destroy. Okay? For one thing, I think it is possible to discriminate in a good way between certain individuals in the Confederate hierarchy. For instance, no sensible person could argue that there isn't a massive difference between someone like James Longstreet, General James Longstreet, and someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest. One later became a Republican, became a member of the pre-war abolition party, and the other got involved with the KKK after the war. So there are differences even among the Confederate leadership, and whatever the reasons someone might have put up those statues in the first place, they can have different meanings today. They can have different meanings for people in the modern world than they did, say, in the early part of the 20th century, when I think they probably were put up for not so admirable reasons. Okay, so there are some whom we might want to spare from the purge. The other thing is, it's not at all clear to me that the, even the majority of men who fought for the Confederacy knew that they were fighting to extend slavery. I mean, I think many of them did, and I think that many of them who fought without really thinking much about what they were fighting for, in some ways it doesn't matter because they were fighting to protect and to extend that system, a system from which, with its racial hierarchy, they in some ways benefited as well. So I acknowledge all that, but I also think that if you try to put yourself in the position of a young would-be soldier in one of these southern communities in 1861, and your options are fairly limited if you don't want to commit familial and communal suicide. In other words, how can you say to the people in your family and the people in your community who are going off to fight that you don't really want to go, or that you think the other side is right? I mean, that's the principled stance that we would like to see, right? We would, maybe we thump our chests and think that if we were in that position, we would make the right decision. But I don't think there's any evidence to support that. I think we would have made the decisions that would have enabled us to, if not promote, at least protect our appearances in our community, to protect our place in the family, not to hurt the people we love most. I mean, there are thousands upon thousands of people who signed up to fight for the Confederacy, and I think that they did so for a number of different reasons, but it's not at all difficult for me to empathize with folks like those whom I've just described, and so to wipe them clean from American memory, I think is an unfortunate thing. But really, most important of all, I think the most unfortunate thing that I see happening is a failure on the part of modern day Americans. I'm not going to talk about context because there's so many things we have to break through before we can even get back to that. But just to think about the American Civil War in a kind of world historical, or from a world historical perspective, this was an incredibly brutal conflict. 2% of the American population died in the Civil War. Civil wars historically are brutal. They're more brutal than any other kind of conflict. And yet, the American Civil War resulted in something you don't see in other places around the world. The losing side, albeit with massive costs to the truth, such as it was pertaining to the origins of the war, but the losing side was able to reintegrate into American life, and not only to go on as Americans, but to be celebrated and embraced as part of something even larger than what the Civil War itself was, to occupy a place inside the American narrative that otherwise, or from which otherwise they would have been excluded. And you say, well, the Union forces had every right to exclude them. Well, yeah, they did, but they didn't. And that's something. That's something that you're giving up when you tear all these things down. I'd give you another example. Back in the American Revolution was in some ways a civil war. And when the American Revolution was over, there were a number of patriots. This is after the peace treaty was signed. There were a number of American patriots who wanted to exact revenge against the Loyalists, the Tories, their neighbors, who had stood against them in their quest for independence. And it was people like Alexander Hamilton. I'm not one to praise Alexander Hamilton from his later days as Treasury Secretary, but Alexander Hamilton in 1784 wrote a wonderful pair of essays under the pseudonym Phocion, in which he argued for the peaceful reintegration of American loyalists. They might have chosen to fight against us, but now they are choosing to live amongst us. Okay? They are once again our countrymen. Okay? And so if we're going to move forward together, we cannot disenfranchise these people. We cannot dispossess them. We cannot treat them like second-class citizens. And the narrative of the late or of the post-Civil War era was such that many Southerners, I think, perceived themselves as having been or in the process of being disenfranchised, dispossessed, and relegated to a permanent second-class citizenship. Now, in time, what happened, and I think this became clear enough to anyone who was paying attention, just within a matter of years after Reconstruction ended, in time, what many of those white Southerners did was to relegate the black Americans, the former slaves, to second-class citizenship. They called it separate but equal, but it was segregation, and it was designed to keep whites and blacks separate in social situations and in politics as well. So there were costs to this reconciliation, but what you're giving up when you tear down these Confederate monuments is that generosity of spirit that Alexander Hamilton showed toward the American loyalists, that generosity of spirit that Abraham Lincoln, I think, would have shown to the people of the Confederacy. And that's something. That's something. When you look around the world, in the former Soviet Union, which of course was a product of a very vicious civil war in the late teens and early 1920s, there were no statues to Alexander Kerensky and the provisional government that followed the Tsar in 1917. In China, there are no statues to Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who were forced to retreat to Taiwan in 1949 following the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. And there are other examples. I mean, in the Vendéan Civil War of the French Revolutionary era, where are the statues to Robespierre, et cetera, et cetera. So the English Civil War is a strange, that's perhaps a different category because things turned so quickly afterward. But the point is, there is something to be said for the post-Civil War, or in the case of Hamilton, the post-American Revolution, reconciliation, and the rejection of recriminations. Okay? I don't know if that means that it's worthwhile to keep a flag or to keep a statue if you know something about the individual who has been honored and you don't particularly like that thing. But be careful with the indiscriminate destruction of Confederate memory. It was, as Ulysses S. Grant wrote in his memoirs, it was one of the worst causes to which men have ever devoted themselves. I mean, I think the Confederate cause was truly horrific, not just misguided, but horrific. But you do lose something, and you lose something that I think is worth remembering when you wipe the Confederates and the Confederacy not only from the history but from American memory, which is what I think a lot of this business with the flags and the statues is designed to do. So take them down if you must, but know the cost.